Hello and welcome back to English Cat. Today we are not just practicing English, we are traveling back in time. We are going to walk in the shoes of a quiet woman who changed the world without raising her voice. This is a story about dignity, courage, and the moment when enough finally meant enough. Sit back, listen closely to the pronunciation and flow, and let's begin the story of Rosa Parks. The evening of December 1st, 1955 was not particularly special in Montgomery, Alabama. It was a Thursday. The air was turning cool, biting at the skin with the damp chill of early winter. The streets were busy with the rush of people finishing their workdays, the noise of engines and the shuffling of feet against the pavement. Among the crowd walked a 42-year-old woman named Rosa. She was small in stature, wearing glasses and a sensible coat. She moved with a quiet grace, the kind of walk that tries not to disturb the air around it. Rosa was a seamstress at a local department store called the Montgomery Fair. All day long her hands had been busy, measuring, cutting, pinning, and pressing. Her shoulders ached from leaning over the ironing board. Her neck was stiff. Her feet were tired. But history misunderstands this tiredness. Years later, people would say, Rosa Parks didn't stand up because her feet were tired. But Rosa herself would correct them. She wasn't physically tired, or at least no more tired than she was at the end of any other working day. She wasn't old, although some people like to imagine her as an old woman. She was 42. No, the only tired she was tired of giving in. To understand why this specific Thursday was different, you have to understand the world Rosa lived in. It was a world split in two. There was a world for white people and a world for black people. There were white water fountains and black water fountains, white schools and black schools, and of course there were the buses. The buses in Montgomery were a daily humiliation. They were a machine designed to remind black citizens every single morning and every single evening that they were considered less than. The rules were complicated and cruel. If you were black, you often had to pay your fare at the front of the bus, then get off the bus, walk outside in the rain or cold to the back door, and climb back in. Sometimes the bus driver would take your money and drive away before you could even reach the back door, leaving you standing there with nothing. Inside the bus, there was an invisible line. The front seats were reserved for white passengers. The back seats were for black passengers. But the middle section, that was the dangerous place. Black people could sit in the middle, but if a white person got on the bus and the front section was full, the black passengers in the middle had to stand up. They had to give away their seats. It wasn't just a rule, it was a law. Rosa knew these rules. She had lived with them her whole life. She remembered her grandfather sitting on their porch with a shotgun when she was a little girl, keeping watch because the Ku Klux Klan was marching down the street. She knew that speaking up could get you arrested, beaten, or killed. But Rosa was not just a seamstress. She was also the secretary of the local chapter of the NAACP, an organization fighting for civil rights. She had spent years documenting stories of injustice. She had listened to people who had been hurt, people who had been wronged. She carried their stories in her heart. She was quiet, yes, but hers was a loud silence. It was a silence full of observation and thinking. So on this Thursday evening, Rosa walked to the bus stop at Court Square. The city lights were blurring in the twilight. She watched the buses roll by, their engines groaning, their exhaust pipes coughing gray smoke into the air. She let the first bus go. It was too crowded. She didn't want the hassle of pushing through a mass of people. She just wanted to sit down. She wanted to go home, make dinner for her husband Raymond, and rest. A few minutes later, a General Motors number 2857 pulled up to the curb. The brakes squealed. The doors folded open with a hiss of air. Rosa stepped up the stairs. She paid her dime. She looked at the driver. His name was James Blake. Rosa recognized him immediately. 12 years earlier, this same driver had kicked her off a bus because she refused to enter through the back door after paying. He was a man known for his meanness. a man who seemed to enjoy the power he held over his passengers. Rosa didn't say a word. She moved past him. Fortunately, she didn't have to go out and re-enter this time. The bus wasn't that full yet. She walked down the aisle. She found a seat in the middle section, the no man's land. She sat in the first row of seats allowed for black passengers. To her right, on the same bench, sat a black man. Across the aisle, 2 black women took their seats. Rosa settled in. She placed her purse on her lap. She smoothed her skirt. She looked out the window at the familiar streets of Montgomery passing by, the Empire Theater, the drugstores, the Christmas lights that were beginning to twinkle in the shop windows. For a moment, it was peaceful. The bus rumbled along. People got on, people got off. It was just a commute. It was just a ride home. But as the bus continued its route, stopping at the Empire Theater stop, a group of white passengers boarded. There were too many of them. The front section, the white section, filled up quickly. Soon, every seat in the front was taken, and one white man was left standing. The driver, James Blake, looked in his rearview mirror. He saw the white man standing. He saw the 4 black passengers sitting in the first row of the middle section. He stopped the bus. The engine idled, vibrating the floor beneath Rosa's feet. The bus went silent. The air in the vehicle seemed to grow heavy, charged with a sudden, sharp tension. Everyone knew what was coming. It was a scene that had played out 1,000 times before in Montgomery. Blake turned in his seat. He looked back at Rosa and the other 3. His voice wasn't a shout, but a command, heavy with the weight of the law and the expectation of obedience. "Let me have those front seats," he said. At first, nobody moved. It was a terrifying moment of hesitation. The other 3 passengers, the man next to Rosa and the 2 women across the aisle, looked at each other. They looked at the driver. They looked at the white man standing. The fear in the air was palpable. It tasted like metal. "Y'all better make it light on yourselves and let me have those seats," Blake said again, his voice harder this time. Slowly, reluctantly, the man next to Rosa stood up. Then the 2 women across the aisle stood up. They moved to the back of the bus, finding space to stand in the crowded aisle. They had done what they were trained to do. They had survived. But Rosa? Rosa Parks did not move. She wasn't trying to be a hero. She wasn't planning a revolution in that exact second. She simply shifted her legs. She looked at the driver. She sat still. The empty seat next to her was now vacant. The white man could have sat there, but the rules of segregation were strict. A white person could not sit in the same row as a black person. It wasn't enough for Rosa to share the row. She had to leave it entirely. She had to disappear to the back. Driver Blake stared at Rosa. He seemed confused. This didn't happen. People moved. They always moved. "Are you going to stand up?" Blake asked. The bus was deadly quiet. Every eye was on the small woman in the glasses. Rosa looked him directly in the eye and spoke a single word. It was a soft word, but it hit the air like a hammer striking a bell. "No." Blake was stunned. "Well, if you don't stand up, I'm going to have to call the police and have you arrested." Rosa didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scream. She just looked at him with that calm, terrifying strength. "You may do that," she said. And with those words, the world began to shift.
Welcome back to English Cat. In our last episode, we left Rosa Parks sitting on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She had just refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. The driver, James Blake, had threatened to call the police. And Rosa, with a calmness that still surprises us today, simply said, "You may do that." Now, let's see what happened next. Listen closely to the details and pay attention to how the tension builds in this part of the story. The bus driver, James Blake, stormed off the bus. He stomped to a nearby payphone to call the authorities. On the bus, the air was thick and heavy. No one spoke. The silence was loud. Some passengers, afraid of trouble, scrambled out of their seats and hurried off the bus, disappearing into the night. They didn't want to be witnesses. They didn't want to be involved. But Rosa stayed. She sat with her hands in her lap, looking out the window. She wasn't praying, she later said. She wasn't thinking about the future. She was just existing. She was enduring. She was waiting to see what the price of her dignity would be. Several minutes passed. The engine of the bus hummed, a low vibration that rattled the windows. Then the siren cut through the evening air. A police car pulled up. 2 officers named Day and Mixon got out. They were large men, their uniforms crisp, their faces serious. They stepped onto the bus. The remaining passengers held their breath. The officers approached the middle section. They looked at the bus driver, who pointed a finger at Rosa. "I needed that seat." The other ones stood up. The officers turned to Rosa. "Why didn't you stand up?" one of them asked. Rosa looked up at him. She didn't shout, she didn't cry, but she asked a question that cut right to the heart of the injustice. It was a question that no one could answer logically. "Why do you all push us around?" she asked. The officer looked surprised. He paused for a moment. He didn't have a good answer. There was no good answer, so he fell back on the only thing he knew. "I don't know," the officer replied, shrugging his shoulders, "but the law is the law, and you're under arrest." He reached out and took Rosa's things. He didn't put handcuffs on her, but he took her by the arm. Rosa stood up. She didn't resist. She walked off the bus, down the stairs, and into the back of the police squad car. As they drove to the city jail, the reality of the situation began to set in. In 1955, a black woman in the back of a police car was in a very dangerous position. Many people had disappeared in custody. Many people had been beaten in cells where there were no witnesses. Rosa was thirsty, her throat dry from fear and the long day at work. But when they arrived at the police station and she saw the water fountain, she didn't dare ask for a drink. She knew the officers might deny her just to be cruel, and she refused to give them the satisfaction of saying no. She was processed. They took her fingerprints. They took her mugshot, the photograph that would eventually become famous around the world. In the photo, she looks dignified, but her eyes are tired. Then they put her in a cell. The cell was cold. It smelled of old metal and despair. Rosa sat on the hard bench. She was alone. This was the moment where courage is tested the most, when the adrenaline fades and you are left alone in the dark. She didn't know if she would ever get out. She didn't know if the Ku Klux Klan was waiting outside. But Rosa Parks was not alone in spirit. The community of Montgomery had a network, a web of connections built for exactly this kind of emergency. Rosa was allowed to make a phone call. She called her house. Her mother answered the phone, panicked. She spoke to her husband, Raymond. "I'm in jail," she said. Raymond didn't hesitate. He rushed to get help. He called E.D. Nixon. E.D. Nixon was a giant of a man, a railway porter and a longtime civil rights leader in Montgomery. He was fierce, loud, and brave. When he heard that Rosa Parks had been arrested, his heart jumped. He wasn't just worried for his friend, he realized something huge had happened. For months, the leaders of the black community had been waiting. They had been looking for a test case. They wanted to challenge the bus laws in court, but they needed a plaintiff, a victim who was perfect. They needed someone with a spotless reputation, someone the city couldn't attack. They had considered other people who had been arrested on buses before, but there was always a problem. Maybe they had argued with the police, or they had a bad history. But Rosa? She was quiet. She was religious. She was hardworking. She was respected by everyone. She was gentle. She's the one, Nixon thought. If we can't win with Rosa, we can't win with anyone. Nixon rushed to the jail with a white lawyer named Clifford Durr. They posted Rosa's bail, which cost $100. When Rosa walked out of the jail cell, it was late. The night was dark. She was tired, but she was free. E.D. Nixon was waiting for her. He asked her the most important question of the night. "Rosa," he said, "will you let us use your case to fight the segregation laws? Will you be the face of this movement?" Rosa hesitated. She knew what this meant. It meant her life would never be private again. It meant death threats. It meant losing her job. It meant putting her husband in danger. Her husband, Raymond, was terrified. "Raymond," he told her, "the white folks will kill you." But Rosa thought about the bus. She thought about the officer saying, "The law is the law." She looked at Nixon and nodded. "Yes," she said, "if you think it will mean something, I'll do it." That yes started a fire. While Rosa went home to try to sleep, another woman was waking up. Her name was Joanne Robinson. She was a professor at Alabama State College. She was brilliant and organized. When she heard about Rosa's arrest, she knew there was no time to waste. It was the middle of the night. Most of the city was asleep, but Joanne Robinson went to her college campus. She unlocked the office. She sat down at a typewriter. She typed out a message. It was short and urgent. "Another woman has been arrested and thrown in jail because she refused to get up out of her seat on the bus. This has to be stopped. Negroes have great power if we only know how to use it. We are therefore asking every Negro to stay off the buses Monday in protest of the arrest and trial." A boycott. She proposed that on Monday, the day of Rosa's trial, no black person should ride the bus, not to work, not to school, not to the store. It was a crazy idea. The bus system depended on black riders. If they didn't ride, the city would lose money. But could they do it? Could they convince 40,000 people to walk miles and miles in the cold? Joanne Robinson spent the rest of the night by herself in that room. She used a mimeograph machine, an old-fashioned copying machine that used purple ink and smelled of chemicals. Thump, 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 thump. The machine cranked out copies, hundreds of them, thousands of them. By the time the sun came up on Friday morning, Joanne Robinson had 35,000 flyers ready. She called her students. "Take these," she said. "Put them in barbershops. Put them in grocery stores. Give them to people leaving factories. Do not get caught." The city of Montgomery was waking up. The white officials drank their coffee, reading the newspaper, thinking it was just another normal Friday. They had no idea that a storm was brewing. They had no idea that the purple-inked flyers spreading through the streets were about to bring the city to its knees. The stage was set. The flyers were out. But would the people listen? Would they be afraid? Monday morning was coming.
Welcome back to English Cat. We have arrived at part 3 of our story. The flyers have been printed. The secret message has been spread. The plan is simple, but dangerous. On Monday morning, no one rides the bus. But plans are easy to make. They are much harder to keep. As the sun rose over Montgomery, Alabama, on Monday, December 5th, 1955, the question on everyone's mind was, will the people actually walk? Let's find out. The weekend before the boycott was a whirlwind of whispers. The flyers that Joanne Robinson had printed were secretly passed from hand to hand. In the barber shops, in the beauty salons, and in the grocery stores, the message traveled. But the biggest boost came from an unexpected place. The black ministers of Montgomery agreed to preach about the boycott in their Sunday sermons. On Sunday morning, from the pulpits of dozens of churches, the pastors told their congregations, "If you want freedom, you must walk. Tomorrow, we stay off the buses." Even the local newspaper helped, by accident. A white reporter found one of the flyers and published a story on the front page, intending to warn the white community that the black citizens were planning trouble. Instead, he just gave free advertising to the boycott. Every black person who hadn't heard the news yet heard it then. Sunday night fell. The city went quiet. A cold rain began to fall.
The leaders of the movement were nervous. They knew that many black people lived miles away from their jobs. They knew that people were poor and couldn't afford taxis. They knew that walking in the December cold was a lot to ask. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of those leaders. At the time, he was not a famous man. He was only 26 years old. He had just moved to Montgomery with his wife, Coretta. He was young, new to town, and anxious. On Monday morning, Dr. King woke up before dawn. He went to the kitchen to get coffee. He and Coretta stood by the front window of their house. There was a bus stop right in front of their door. Usually, the 6 a.m. bus was the South Jackson line. It was always packed with black domestic workers, maids and cooks traveling to the white side of town to prepare breakfast. It was usually so full that people were pressed against the windows. King checked his watch. He stared at the street. The headlights of the bus cut through the morning darkness. The bus slowed. The brakes squeaked. Coretta gasped. "Martin, look!" The bus was illuminated by the interior lights, and it was empty. There was nobody on it, just the driver, staring at the road, confused. King couldn't believe it. He thought he was dreaming. He said, "Let's wait for the next one." 15 minutes later, the second bus arrived. It, too, was completely empty. Then the third bus. Empty. King ran to his car. He drove around the city. What he saw was a miracle. The sidewalks were crowded, but not with people waiting for buses. They were crowded with people walking. Old men were walking with canes. Mothers were walking with babies on their hips. Students were walking with books in their arms. Some people were riding mules. Some were in horse-drawn buggies. Some were hitchhiking. But the buses, the big yellow city buses, rolled down the streets like ghosts. They were hollow metal shells. The black citizens of Montgomery, 40,000 strong, had spoken with their feet. Later that morning, Rosa Parks went to the courthouse for her trial. The trial lasted only 30 minutes. The judge didn't care about justice. He cared about the rules. He found her guilty and fined her $10 plus $4 for court costs. But Rosa didn't pay. Her lawyers appealed the decision. But the trial wasn't the main event anymore. The main event was happening in the streets. The leaders of the movement realized they had captured lightning in a bottle. They formed a new organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association, or the MIA, and they needed a president. They needed someone who could speak to the people. They chose the young 26-year-old preacher Martin Luther King Jr. He had hardly any time to prepare. He had 20 minutes to write the most important speech of his life. That evening, a mass meeting was held at the Holt Street Baptist Church. The leaders expected a few hundred people, but when they arrived, the streets were blocked for blocks around the church. 5,000 people had gathered. They were outside on the lawn, they were on the steps, they were filling the aisles. Loudspeakers were set up so the people outside could hear. The mood was electric. It was a mixture of joy, anger, and determination. Dr. King stepped up to the podium. The crowd went silent. He didn't have a full script, just a few notes. He opened his mouth, and his deep baritone voice filled the room. "We are here this evening for serious business. We are here in a general sense because first and foremost, we are American citizens, and we are determined to apply our citizenship to the fullness of its meaning." He spoke about Rosa Parks. He spoke about her character. And then he said the words that would define the movement. "There comes a time," King shouted, his voice rising, "that people get tired. We are here this evening to say to those who have mistreated us so long that we are tired. Tired of being segregated and humiliated. Tired of being kicked about by the brutal feet of oppression." The crowd erupted. They cheered, they clapped, they stomped their feet until the floorboards shook. King finished with a call to action. He told them to keep walking. He told them that their protest must be peaceful. He said, "We must not become bitter. We must meet hate with love." When the speech was over, the leaders asked the crowd a question. The boycott was supposed to be for just one day, just Monday. Do you want to end the boycott, or do you want to continue? 5,000 voices shouted back as one, "Continue." They voted to stay off the buses until the city changed the laws. They didn't know how long it would take. They thought maybe a week, maybe a month. They had no idea that they were about to walk for more than a year.
Welcome back to English Cat. We are now in part 4 of our story. The excitement of the first day is over. The speeches have been made. Now, the people of Montgomery face a massive problem. They have voted to stay off the buses until the laws change. But life does not stop. People still have to work. Children still have to go to school. How do you move 40,000 people around a city every day without using the bus system? Let's listen to how they did the impossible. The Montgomery bus boycott was not just a protest, it was a masterpiece of organization. The leaders of the movement realized quickly that enthusiasm alone would not carry them. They needed a system. They created a massive private transportation network. It operated almost like a taxi service. They set up dispatch stations at churches. People would walk to the nearest station in the morning, then volunteer drivers would pick them up and take them to their jobs. It was incredible to watch. There were over 300 cars involved. Doctors, lawyers, and teachers, people who owned cars, became drivers for maids and janitors. They woke up at 5 a.m., drove people to work, went to their own jobs, and then drove people home again at night. Money poured in from around the world to support them. They bought station wagons to carry more people. They paid for gas and tires. The system was so efficient that the bus company began to lose huge amounts of money. The buses were driving around empty, burning fuel for no reason. But as the boycott continued, the city of Montgomery got angry. The white officials realized that the black community was not going to give up easily, so they decided to fight back. First, the police started harassing the drivers. If a carpool driver was going even 1 mile per hour over the speed limit, they got a ticket. If they paused too long to pick up a passenger, they got a ticket. Then the insurance companies canceled the car insurance for the station wagons. But the movement was smart. Dr. King and his team found a black insurance agent in Atlanta, Georgia, and later even Lloyd's of London in England to insure their cars. Every time the city built a wall, the boycotters built a door. When the laws didn't stop them, the violence began. One night in January, while Dr. King was at a meeting, a bomb exploded on his front porch. His wife, Coretta, and their baby daughter were inside. Thankfully, they were not hurt, but when Dr. King arrived home, a furious crowd of black men had gathered outside. They had guns, they had knives, they were ready to fight the police. They were ready to burn the city down. Dr. King stood on his broken porch. He raised his hand for silence. "We must meet violence with nonviolence," he told them. "Remember, if I am stopped, this movement will not stop. Go home with this glowing faith and this radiant assurance." The crowd lowered their weapons. They went home. It was a moment that proved this movement was different. It was a movement of the soul, not just the body. The city tried one last desperate move. They found an old law from 1921 that prohibited boycotts. They indicted 89 leaders of the movement, including Rosa Parks and Dr. King. They were all arrested. But instead of being ashamed, the people were proud. They dressed in their Sunday best clothes to go to jail. It became a badge of honor to be arrested for freedom. When Dr. King was found guilty, he walked out of the courthouse smiling. The world was watching, and the city of Montgomery looked cruel and foolish.
Through the winter, the spring, and the hot Alabama summer, the people walked. They walked through rain, they walked through heat. There is a famous story about an elderly woman named Mother Pollard. She was old and her walking was slow. One of the drivers stopped and offered her a ride. "Mother Pollard, aren't you tired?" he said. She looked at him and smiled. She said a sentence that became the motto of the entire boycott. "My feet is tired, but my soul is at rest." The boycott lasted for over a year, 381 days to be exact. The bus company was almost bankrupt. The downtown businesses were losing money because black customers weren't shopping as much. But the city officials were stubborn. They refused to integrate the buses. They would rather let the bus system die than let black and white people sit together. It seemed like a stalemate, a tie. The boycotters wouldn't ride, and the city wouldn't change. But while the people were walking in the streets, the lawyers were fighting in the courts. A lawsuit filed by the NAACP named Browder versus Gale had been slowly moving up through the legal system. It challenged the idea that segregation on buses was constitutional. Everything now depended on 9 judges in Washington, the Supreme Court. If the court ruled against them, the boycott might fail. All that walking would be for nothing. But if the court ruled for them... In November 1956, the decision finally came down.
Welcome back to English Cat for the final chapter of our story. We have walked the long road with Rosa Parks and the people of Montgomery. We have seen the injustice, the arrest, the empty buses, and the incredible endurance of a community that refused to give up. Now, after 381 days of walking, the end is in sight. The Supreme Court has made its decision. But the story doesn't end when the boycott ends. Today, we will see what happened when the buses started rolling again, and we will look at the lasting legacy of the woman who started it all. Let's finish the story. It was November 13th, 1956. The news reached Montgomery like a thunderclap. The United States Supreme Court had ruled that bus segregation in Alabama was unconstitutional. The laws that Rosa Parks had broken were illegal. The city of Montgomery had lost. The people had won. But the boycott didn't end that day. The leaders, careful and smart, waited. They waited for the official court order to arrive in the mail. They didn't want to celebrate too early. They kept walking for another month. Finally, on December 20th, the official papers arrived. The next morning, December 21st, 1956, at 5:55 a.m., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., E.D. Nixon, and Ralph Abernathy walked to a bus stop. The bus pulled up. The door opened. The driver was a white man. He looked at the group of black leaders standing there. A year ago, this would have been a scene of conflict. But today, the driver simply smiled. "I believe you are Reverend King," the driver said. "We are glad to have you with us this morning." Dr. King stepped onto the bus. He paid his fare, and for the first time in history, he sat in a front seat. He sat right behind the driver. He looked out the window as the bus rolled through the streets of Montgomery. It was the same city, but it was a different world. The boycott was over. The buses were integrated. But for Rosa Parks, the victory was bittersweet. We often like to think that heroes are rewarded immediately, but history is more complicated than that. Rosa had become a symbol of freedom around the world, but in Montgomery, she was a target. She lost her job at the department store. Her husband, Raymond, lost his job as a barber. The constant death threats made their lives a nightmare. The telephone would ring in the middle of the night, and voices on the other end would threaten to bomb their home. They were broke, unable to find work in the city that they had helped to change. In 1957, Rosa and Raymond made a difficult decision. They left Montgomery.
they left the South. They moved north to Detroit, Michigan, hoping for a quieter life. Life in Detroit was not easy either. Rosa worked as a seamstress in a small factory. She struggled with poverty and health issues. For years, the woman who sparked a revolution lived in a small apartment, sewing clothes to make ends meet, largely forgotten by the headlines. It wasn't until 1965 that things began to change for her. A young politician named John Conyers was running for Congress. He knew who Rosa Parks was. He knew her value. He hired her to work in his office. For the next 20 years, Rosa worked for Congressman Conyers. She handled housing issues for homeless people. She listened to the problems of the poor. She continued to serve, just as she always had, quietly, efficiently, and with great dignity. As she grew older, the world began to remember her again. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She received the Congressional Gold Medal. Schools and streets were named after her. But she never let the fame change her. She always remained the quiet woman with the glasses. When people asked her why she did it, she never gave a long, philosophical speech. She just said, "I felt I had a right to be treated as any other passenger. We had endured that kind of treatment for too long." Rosa Parks died on October 24, 2005. She was 92 years old. Her death marked a rare moment in American history. Her body was flown to Washington, D.C. She was laid in honor in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. She was the first woman and the second Black person ever to receive this honor. Thousands of people lined up for hours to walk past her casket. Presidents, senators, and celebrities came to pay their respects. But more importantly, regular people came. Bus drivers came. Maids came. Children came. They came to say goodbye to the seamstress who taught the world a lesson about power. Rosa Parks taught us that you don't need to be a general to fight a war. You don't need to be a politician to change a law. You don't need to be loud to be heard. She taught us that power is not just about muscle or money. Power is about the ability to say no when everyone else expects you to say yes. It is the power of knowing your own worth. When she sat down on that bus in 1955, she didn't just claim a seat for herself. She claimed a place for all of us. She showed that one person, in one moment, can tip the scales of history. The bus number 2857, the actual vehicle she rode in, is now in a museum. It is silent and still. But if you listen closely to the story, you can still hear the echo of her voice. You can still hear the sound of 40,000 people walking, and you can hear the sound of a wall crumbling down. Thank you for listening to this series on English Cat. We hope this story has improved your English listening skills, but more than that, we hope it has inspired you. Remember, even when your feet are tired, keep your soul at rest and keep moving forward. Until next time, goodbye.